The last thing my son said to me wasn't, "I love you" or "I'll call you later." It was one flat sentence that still replays in my head like a warning: "I need to go." Then he vanished so completely that for months I didn't even know what state he was in. No calls, no texts, no address, nothing. At first I told myself he was just being dramatic, that he was punishing me, that he'd cool off and come back. But I didn't understand until much later that I hadn't just said the wrong thing. I had done something that cracked the foundation of our relationship. My name is Denise. I'm 53, and I'm an HR director at a massive corporation. I've built my identity around workplace fairness, equality, and fighting discrimination. I've sat across from women who were overlooked, interrupted, underpaid, punished for being pregnant, or dismissed as too emotional. I've watched discrimination hide behind words like culture fit. I've spent years being the calm voice in the room saying, "This ends today." I raised my son Ethan on my own. His father left when Ethan was 3, and suddenly it was just the two of us, schedules and sacrifice. Me doing 2 jobs at once, one at work and one at home. Because I lived in a world where inequality was everywhere. I made a decision early. I was going to raise a boy who understood reality. Ethan is white, male, smart, and healthy, and I didn't want him to grow up thinking the world was equal for everyone. So I taught him about privilege the way I taught him to look both ways before crossing the street. Not as an accusation, but as a rule about how society works. I'd tell him doors would open for him that wouldn't open for other people, and not to confuse that with being special. Be grateful, be fair, be aware. For most of his life, I felt proud, because on paper, he turned out exactly like the success story I thought I was building. By 28, he had a steady IT job, his own apartment, a reliable car, no chaos, no emergencies. Financially independent, exactly what I hoped for. So when he called me on a Tuesday night instead of the weekend, I knew something was different. I remember it perfectly. I was in my kitchen with a glass of wine and a documentary about workplace harassment playing in the background. He said, "Mom, can we talk? Like really talk?" And my heart shifted into that alert feeling. I muted the TV, set down my wine, and said, "Of course, what's going on?" After a long pause, he admitted, "I've been struggling, like really struggling." My first thought went straight to practical problems, job loss, bills, something I could fix. So I asked if he needed money, and he said no, that it wasn't that he didn't know how to explain it. I could hear him breathing like he was holding something back. Then he said the sentence that should have made me stop and just listen. "I'm really lonely, Mom, like desperately lonely." Instead of hearing it as a crisis, my brain treated it like an inconvenience, a problem with a simple solution. I told him he should go out more, join activities, meet people. He said it wasn't that simple, that he didn't have real friends now. That surprised me because I always assumed men just naturally formed friendships. So I asked about coworkers, and he said they were friendly at work but nobody invited him anywhere, and he ate lunch alone every day. Without meaning to, I slipped into the parental tone that thinks directness is love. I told him he was an adult and needed to put himself out there. He said he had, that he'd joined groups and meets and hobbies and nothing stuck, that the guys were polite but went back to their own lives. Then his voice tightened as he admitted the other part. He hadn't been on a date in 2 years. I felt myself harden because 2 years sounded like a verdict, like he wasn't trying. I asked what he'd been doing to meet women, and he said everything: AFs, events, speed dating, 1 match a month, no replies, ghosts after a few messages. And that's when I became the safest version of myself, the HR director, the lecturer, the person who knows how to win an argument instead of sit in someone else's pain. I said women don't owe him attention. He took a shaky breath and said he knew that and wasn't claiming anyone owed him anything. He was just telling me how isolated he felt. But instead of letting that land, I reframed it into a social issue I could critique. I started talking about how women deal with harassment and unwanted attention. He tried to pull me back by saying he wasn't talking about entitlement, he was talking about basic human connection. But I was on a roll. I talked about men being conditioned to feel entitled, about objectification, about power dynamics. Like I was presenting a training seminar instead of talking to my son. Then he said, "Softer, Mom, please. I'm trying to tell you that I'm in pain." The word pain irritated me because it sounded dramatic, and I responded by listing everything he had: job, apartment, freedom. He said having material things didn't mean he wasn't emotionally suffering. And then I made the mistake that detonated everything. I laughed. Not cruelly in my mind, but a disbelieving chuckle. I said, "Emotional suffering. Ethan, you're a straight white man in America. You have every advantage." The line went silent in a way that should have stopped me, but I didn't notice because I kept going. I listed what I considered real suffering: women being passed over, walking to your car at night, being dismissed in meetings. I told him his loneliness was nothing compared to what women face every day. Only after I'd built my whole argument did I realize he hadn't spoken. I asked if he was listening, and his voice came back flat and drained. "I'm here." I told him he needed perspective. I told him to volunteer and see real hardship. Then he said quietly, "Mom," and I said, "Yeah," and he said, "I need to go." I tried to stop him because in my mind, we were in the middle of something important. He said goodbye and hung up. I stood there staring at my phone and told myself a story that made me comfortable. He got emotional and needed space. Men aren't good at hard conversations. He'd call back. He didn't. Week 1, nothing. Week 2, voicemail. Week 3, unanswered calls. By the time Christmas came and he still hadn't replied, I clung to the idea that he wouldn't skip our tradition. I texted asking his plans, and it was read but unanswered. I called Christmas morning and his voicemail was full. I drove to his apartment and his car wasn't there. A neighbor casually told me he'd left with suitcases to visit friends, because he told me he had none. I stood there realizing either he lied or something changed. And the terrifying thought was that whatever changed, it happened without me, maybe because of me. That Christmas I spent alone for the first time in 28 years, refreshing my phone like a fool. January, nothing. February, nothing. By month 6, panic finally broke through my pride and I called his work expecting reassurance. Instead, they told me he resigned 2 weeks ago. I drove to his apartment like I was running from fire and found a different car in his spot. The leasing office told me he moved out with no forwarding address. That's when I finally understood this wasn't silent treatment, it was an exit. For weeks, I lived in a fog of obsession, replaying the phone call, searching old photos, texting messages that sounded calm but were really disguised, lectures, until desperation made me do something I'm ashamed of. I created a fake social media account because he had blocked me. When I found him, I felt relief first because he was alive and okay, then hurt because he looked okay without me. He was in a different state, smiling in group photos, hiking trips, game nights, dinner parties with a woman beside him named Lena. He looked genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen in years. I scrolled like a thief until one post stopped my heart. A photo of him sitting in a circle in what looked like a support group, captioned, 6 months into healing from family trauma. Finally, learning my feelings were valid all along. I stared at the words family trauma, feeling defensive and confused, because I thought I gave him everything. I thought I loved him. So how could he call it trauma? That question haunted me until I finally booked therapy with Dr. Klein. I told her my version of the story. Ethan complained. I gave him perspective. He disappeared. She said gently, "So your son came to you vulnerably and you minimized him?" I argued I was trying to help, and she asked what made me feel his pain wasn't real. I wanted to hide behind the idea that his problems were minor compared to systemic oppression, but she wouldn't let me. She said we weren't discussing society, we were discussing my son. Then she asked, when someone you love tells you they're suffering, what do they need in that moment? I swallowed and said, support. She asked what I gave him instead, and the honest answer was a lecture. She asked how I thought it felt to receive that. That question followed me for days. I replayed the phone call from his side, him alone in his apartment trying to be brave, trying to reach for his mother, and me telling him he had no right to feel cold because other people were freezing. Hearing my laugh again made me feel sick. As the year passed, the silence forced me to admit a terrifying possibility. Maybe I wasn't the hero of this story. Maybe I was the wound. In therapy, I finally said, I think I was wrong. Dr. Klein asked what I did wrong, and I whispered, he trusted me, and I made him feel small. She asked what I wanted to do with that understanding, and I said I needed to apologize. A real apology. So I wrote a letter, and rewrote it again and again, until it stopped sounding like a defense, and started sounding like a mother. I told him he came to me vulnerable, and I responded with dismissiveness. I told him I laughed when he told me he was in pain, and I turned his suffering into a debate instead of treating it like something sacred. I said he deserved comfort, not correction, and I didn't expect forgiveness, but I needed him to know I finally understood. Sending it felt like dropping my pride off a cliff, because if he didn't respond, it would confirm I'd lost him for good. I hired someone to find his address because I didn't know another way. Then I sent it certified mail. 2 weeks later, a text from an unknown number appeared. I got your letter. I need more time. My hands shook because it was him. I wanted to flood the screen with emotion and explanations, but I forced myself not to control the moment. I replied, take all the time you need. I love you, he wrote back. I know. A month later, he texted again saying he'd try a phone call, but things couldn't go back to how they were. I agreed immediately. When he called, his voice sounded steadier, less like a boy asking permission to be sad and more like a man who had learned he didn't need permission. He told me about the year I missed, the move, the therapy, the friendships. Lena. Then he said the sentence that hit me hardest. I wasn't just lonely for friends and dating, I was lonely in our relationship too. When I asked what he meant, he explained he spent his whole life trying to earn my respect by being the right kind of man, the enlightened kind, the self-sufficient kind, the kind who didn't need anything. That night, he said, I needed my mom, and you treated me like a case study. I closed my eyes and whispered, you're right, I turned you into a symbol. He didn't yell or insult me. He just said he realized our relationship was one-sided, that he was always trying to be what I wanted, and when he finally admitted he was hurting, I laughed. The silence after that was thick, but this time I didn't fill it with a speech. I just said, I'm sorry. No excuses. He told me he needed boundaries, no lectures when he shares something personal, no comparisons to societal suffering, no turning his emotions into a debate. If I can't support him, I need to say so instead of redirecting. We agreed to start small with monthly calls and build slowly. Over time, the calls got better because I practiced listening like it was a skill. Months later, he told me Lena wanted to meet me eventually, and that she helped him understand he deserved care. And that sentence hurt because I realized I hadn't taught him that. When they moved back to our state, we met at a neutral restaurant. Ethan looked calm and strong. Lena was warm but protective, and I could tell she was watching me. I apologized again without excuses, telling him I failed him when he needed me and he deserved better. Lena nodded politely, like she was silently warning me not to make him pay again. Gradually, we found a new normal based on honesty instead of obligation. Then Ethan called one day and said they were engaged, and invited me carefully like it was a test of trust. I accepted gratefully. At the wedding, he thanked friends who supported him through hard times and didn't mention me. And I didn't need him to because I had forfeited the right to be his safe place during that season. Later, he called again with news that made my knees go weak. Lena was pregnant. They weren't telling the world yet, but they wanted family to know. The fact he called me family, again, felt like an undeserved miracle. Then he asked if I wanted to know what made him willing to rebuild. I said yes. He told me it wasn't just the apology, it was that I actually changed, that I stopped seeing him as a representative of male privilege and started seeing him as my son. That sentence stayed with me for days because it exposed something ugly in me. I had let ideology become more important than intimacy. I had become so committed to being correct that I forgot my first job was to be loving. Years after the phone call that broke us, my granddaughter was born. Ethan called from the hospital and asked if I wanted to meet her. Her name was Noah, named after Lena's grandmother. When I held that tiny sleeping baby, I felt gratitude so heavy, it felt like regret, and hope so fragile, it felt like fear. Ethan watched me carefully, not accusingly but attentively. Like a man checking whether the person holding his child understood the responsibility. I whispered that she was perfect. Ethan nodded and said she was going to grow up knowing her feelings matter. I swallowed hard and promised yes, she will. In that moment I understood the unspoken boundary. If I ever dismiss this child the way I dismissed him, I will lose them both. I looked down at her tiny face and made a silent promise that I would not be the kind of adult who turns a child's pain into a lecture. I would listen, I would validate, I would be safe. Because my son taught me something I never learned in all my trainings and policies. Boundaries aren't punishment, they're protection. Love without respect is just control, wearing a kind face. The woman who laughed on that Tuesday night feels like a stranger to me now. Someone who confused being socially aware with being emotionally wise. Ethan broke the cycle by walking away. And the only reason I ever got him back is because I finally learned the lesson I should have known from the beginning. People don't need you to be right. They need you to be there. And sometimes you don't realize you're losing someone until they're already gone.
If this confession kept you hooked, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We share powerful true stories every day that explore the complex realities of life.